But there's one place where the heat never ceases, and that's the figurative heat of war and threats of war, and that's Israel. Today I want to talk about the first part of a two-part session which we'll have today and then again on May 9th, the second part of this, relating to Israel and the things that are going on there today. This one I call the State of Israel a history lesson. I don't mean it to be a history lesson such as we would have in school, but it is important to understand the facts behind the current situation in Israel. So I want to look at today the prophecy related to the restoration of Israel, but more importantly, what's happened there since Israel became a nation. As you look at today's environment, and of course all the information that's coming out today, it's very difficult to sort out fact from fiction. We don't know what to believe, and we always perhaps get a biased viewpoint. So we'll try today to examine what has gone on in Israel, to show the establishment of that state, to make some recommendations to you about where we can get good information, really to look at the current situation as it relates to Bible prophecy. So let's begin. Ezekiel 37:11 contains a scripture that reads, "Then he said to me, Son of man, these bones are the whole house of Israel. Behold, they say, our bones are dried up, and our hope has perished. We are completely cut off." That's the New American Standard reading. Really is a prophecy about Israel's destitute state up until the time that they were reestablished. We know in the late 1800s, and then eventually be made the state they are today. Recently, there's been a lot of activity in Israel with new people migrating there. As you know, immigrants and the Aliyah, in other words, the return to Israel, has been a big part of the work for many, many years. Last October, there was an interesting point at which 200 new immigrants arrived in Israel. They came from around the world that day. It was a national day of celebration. They came from South Africa, they came from Mexico, they came from England, France, Russia, Belgium, Turkey, Switzerland. 7 different flights all coming there at the same time. There was a special ceremony that day, or the day before, the day after that they arrived. At that point, the spokesman said that that year, the year of October to October, would be a great year for immigration, expecting a great upsurge in many Jewish communities, especially those that were still coming from the former Soviet Union, 20% or more immigrants coming in the next year. 20% of those that would be coming would come from the former Soviet era. As you know, the weak economy around the world has driven many Jews to rethink their position on where they want to spend the rest of their lives, and many of them have been migrating to Israel. Just a few months earlier, Netanyahu, the prime minister, made some outstanding statements that I wanted to review, because it does relate especially to this idea of Israel as a sign of where we are at this time in Bible history and Bible chronology, but also about what God has been doing behind the scenes. This is from an article that was written and reporting on Netanyahu's speech. Let's read this. It says, though it may take many years of continued immigration to Israel, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu believes Israel will eventually have more Jews in it than are elsewhere in the world. Speaking to a group of 238 new immigrants traveling from North America on August 4th. Now remember, I said another 200 had come in a special ceremony in October. Netanyahu told them, "We're very close to a tipping point. I think all of you are going to be part of it, and you'll witness it. And here it is. For the first time in about 2,000 years, there are going to be more Jews in Israel than Jews outside of Israel. That's a pretty astounding statement. Then he went on to report Israel, according to the Central Bureau of Statistics, had approximately 5,593,000 Jewish residents. That was last April when they took their last full census. Netanyahu said to the immigrants which came on a flight, the number of Jews is going to grow and grow and grow because the Jewish future is here in Israel. Of course, that's no surprise to us, but it is encouraging to see this kind of commitment coming out of Israel, because as we know, the regathering of Jews to Israel is one of the great signs of our Lord's return, and also the fact that we know we're approaching the time of the end. In the next presentation, we're going to talk more about the return of Jews to Israel and that growing number, but I think this is a pretty important fact that we should keep in mind. There is some setbacks that have been going on. One of those has been our own U.S. President's efforts at peace. I have been very discouraged by the work of both President Obama and Secretary of State Clinton, because both of them have put a very difficult operating environment around Israel. As you know, last year in October, about the same time that Netanyahu was receiving these new immigrants, President Obama won the Nobel Peace Prize for his work in the Middle East. His envoy was there holding intensive meetings with the Israel and Palestinians, trying to restart the talks. Secretary George Mitchell, who was the diplomat in that region, was boosted by the fact that not only did Obama support this, but this Nobel Peace Prize that he was awarded after just a short time in office put us in a very difficult position. And yet you look today, they're no closer at brokering peace between Israel and Palestinians within 2 years as he wanted to be. Of course, we know that it is not God's intention for them ever to surrender that land. But it has been quite discouraging, because I think it makes a difficult situation for Israel in trying to represent themselves in the world. So I'm not entirely optimistic that the United States is going to continue to support Israel in its work the way it has in the past. It is true that we still need them desperately as the main force of democracy in the Middle East. But yet it's not for the support of Israel itself as much as to protect our own interest. With that as background, let's go back to the beginning, as I said, the state of Israel. Let's go back to November 29th, 1947, and here you do recognize Theodore Herzl, who was very instrumental in setting up the work. At that point, November 29th, 1947, the United Nations partitioned the land of Palestine, what was then Palestine, into two states, one Arab and one Jewish. And if you look at this map on the inset, you'll see how these were sort of set up. Each was composed of three major sections that you see there. The yellow that you see were the Arab states, and sort of the brown or orange were designated as Jewish states. So you can see where it was at the time when the UN envisioned it. The Jewish state would receive the coastal plain, as you see there. They would also then get from Haifa, which you see there, down to Rehovot, which is the eastern Galilee. You see the Galilee is the little spot in the sea there that you see up here. They would get that, and then the Negev, which is part of the southern outpost, you see down below, that was what's now Eilat. The Arabs were designated to have a fair amount of land. As you'll see here, they received the western Galilee, the yellow part there, just west of the Galilee. They would get the town of Acre, and they would get the Sumerian highlands and the Judean highlands. They would also get that southern coast, as you'll see, that stretches down to Majda, which is now Ashkelon. Incidentally, that's the area where Mary Magdalene came from. and then encompassed what is now the Gaza Strip and a section of the desert, and you'll see along the Egyptian border. And that was perhaps a sensitive part because I'm not sure Egypt ever wanted that. The report that was issued at the time, the UN report, placed the mostly Arab town of Jaffa, which is just south of Tel Aviv, in the Jewish state. But then there was such protest that it was moved up to the Arab state before the proposal ever went to the UN. When the British then evacuated on May 14, 1948, it led the acting Israeli government to say, okay, now we're going to declare independence. This was 2,500 years after it had been totally destroyed by the Babylonians. That was a very significant event. We'll talk more about that in just a couple minutes. That declaration is what initiated the period of trouble in the land that continues today. You hear a lot of talk about the 1948 borders, but here were the borders that were laid out in the UN that were never accepted by the Arabs. And that was really where a lot of the issue has come up since. Let's go back to that Ezekiel 37 chapter. Remember what he said. Our bones are dried up. Our hope has perished. We are completely cut off. What does Ezekiel describe there? Ezekiel's describing the prophecy of bringing back this nation that was once destroyed. Remember, they were a nation at that time. They had not experienced such a regathering prior to the Babylonian captivity of Ezekiel's own day. So you know that he was prophesying about our day. God answers Ezekiel in the prophecy. We look at Ezekiel 37:3. He says, "Can these bones live?" Ezekiel said, "O Lord God, you know." Ezekiel knew that it would not be an ordinary thing for them to take place. Only a miracle at that point could revive the glory of Israel had, and only God could provide an answer like that. So God told Israel, prophesy to these bones and say, O dry bones, hear the word of the Lord. Then we skip down to verses 7 and 8. A noise and rattling, and the bones came together. The sinews and the flesh came upon them, and the skin covered them over, but there was no breath in them. So what happened? The separated skeleton came together, reuniting those houses of Judah and Israel. That was a prophetic description of the beginning of the restored nation. But notice what it says in that verse 8. There was no breath in them. They were there, but they were powerless at that point. Remember what began early on in 1878? Very small gathering of Zionist Jews in the area called Petah Tikva. That was in 1878. 70 years later, we had the birth of a nation, the breath coming into that nation. Here we had Jewish people. They were in a Jewish land. They were under Jewish rule. But it wasn't going to come easy for them. It was not a peaceful negotiation process that got them where they were. When the British troops began to exit in March of 1948, after the UN had laid out these areas, and they now said we're going to turn this over to these groups to manage themselves, March of 1948, they began to exit. That mandate of 1917 had called for them to do that, and then that 1947, when the discussion had taken place in November, they exposed, when there were no longer British troops there, they exposed Jewish convoys that were bringing in food to Israel and into Jerusalem to help support them. The first thing that happened at that point was an Arab ambush that killed a lot of the people that were carrying those supplies. They went on to attack the Jews that were in Jerusalem. On April 9th, then the members of what was then the National Military Organization and Fighters for the Freedom of Israel said, we cannot take this. We no longer have the British helping us. So they attacked the Arab village, the west of Jerusalem. That began the struggle for Israel's right to exist in a land that had been designated for them. That had begun. You see that was the summer of 1948. As you see the map, you'll see the part that was held by Israelis and the part that was held by Arabs, and you can see they were in a very dire situation. When they struck this Arab village, and then what happened the next day after this, the Arabs hit Jerusalem again. 3 days later, Arab mortars struck kindergartners in the Jewish quarter, hit a Jewish medical convoy that was bound for Hadassah Hospital. The Arab Higher Committee said that no Jew would have been spared had the remaining British troops not intervened. This is a picture that you see in a description of this massacre. I'm not going to read all these, but you'll have an opportunity to do that on your own. These are some of the history that you see of what actually happened when they were attacked. They attacked the hospital, Mount Scopus. The victims, most of them were nurses, doctors, staff, and there was a lot of discussion about what this was for. They said it was done for a reprisal for the raid the day before, but yet that in itself had been a defensive maneuver. So there was a lot of things being said even then to try to change it. But this massacre was planned well in advance, and it came against not soldiers, but against medical personnel and civilians. There was a 5-month period between December 1947 and April 1948 that was so intense that not only were some of the British troops killed, but you can see the kind of numbers. 1,100 Jews, 3,500 Arabs killed. And that wasn't even the start of the war. That was just the beginning. So you can see this struggle, this resistance against Israel having any kind of position for themselves in the land began way early on. It was the War of Independence then that brought a great deal of fighting that has never ceased since. This is a map that shows you the War of Independence. It's well worth looking at this as to how they were attacked from all fronts, from the south, the east, and the north. In fact, there are many that believe this was fulfillment of prophecies that were given in Isaiah, also in David. When David was attacked by those surrounding nations, he had much the same defense that he had to put on against these enemies from the north, the west, or the east, and the south. Let's look at what happened as we start this War of Independence. As I said before, British rule over Palestine was to end 1948. It ended formally at midnight on May 14, 1948, which would have been the Jewish Sabbath. So what happened, David Ben-Gurion, who then was head of what had been a provisional government of Israel, reads a Declaration of Independence on a radio broadcast 2 hours prior to the beginning of the Sabbath, declaring their independence. Israel was rejoicing. They would become an independent state at 1 second after midnight. Think about that. 1/3 of the world's population of Jews had been annihilated. Nazi Germany had killed them. 600,000 that now populated Israel were ready to stand for the first time. Interestingly enough, 38 years had passed since Pastor Russell had urged the Jewish leaders at the Hippodrome in New York City, which now is the site of Madison Square Garden, to return to the land that was promised to their heirs. There have been a lot of discussions about establishing a place in Africa, establishing a place in Ethiopia, but Jews were encouraged, and the pastor was among those that encouraged them. Israel was to be their homeland. And here they were finally, from that first Zionist Congress, which had been in 1897, now in 1948, ready to become a country of their own. From that 48 to 1950, you can see the kind of immigration that was going on from all over then. When that land opened up, and even despite the difficulties and challenges of becoming a state, you can see that they were coming from all over. I'll talk more about that in the next presentation we talk about the regathering of Israel, but it was a very significant event because not only those that had first established colony there, but many started coming from all over to take up their homeland in Israel. Yet within hours, as soon as that was read by Ben-Gurion, within hours, that nation was surrounded by armies of the Arab League. As I said, 600,000 citizens were there in Israel. A lot of those had survived the Holocaust, a devastating effect on them. At that point, none of them were prepared for the kind of war and resistance they would get. Here I'm showing you I think, one of the best books that were written around that War of Independence. If you want to read about the facts and what had happened there, Benny Morris wrote this book called 1948. It was on the first Arab-Israeli war. It does a good job of establishing what actually was going on there. There were some significant things as far as Israel that would tell you this was God's work. They only had 3 tanks. They weren't prepared for war. They had no air force. They had no fighters. They had no bombers. Yet those fighters held off 74 Arab fighters and bombers. But yet 6,000 Israelis were killed out of 600,000. 1% of the population wiped out by this war. The food became so scarce that people survived, we're told, on dandelions and weeds as they tried to struggle through this war. There was such severe rationing of water that sanitation was almost impossible. The odds were so far against them at being successful in fending off their enemies. But a miracle happened. First indication that this was indeed a reestablishment by God of the nation. One of the places where this miracle, which I'll mention, is portrayed are in 2 places. A 1966 film, which it's called Cast a Giant Shadow. You can rent it at most of the video stores. But it dramatizes the career of a fighter called Mickey Marcus. He had a major part in the construction of what would become that miracle, the Burma Road. And then in the 2006 film, O Jerusalem, there are also scenes in which we see food and supplies being brought in to Jerusalem on what would become the Burma Road. This is what happened. Jewish soldiers halted the Egyptian tanks that were coming up from the south. Remember, I showed you that sweep up from the south. And the Syrian army that was coming from the north. Remember those arrows showing you that attack from the north. While they were doing that, they carve out this, by hand, this 3-mile stretch of road through all these rock and hillsides. That was called the Burma Road. The Burma Road was actually the China Road, remember, that went through the mountains. And it was called the Burma Road in Israel because it had been very similarly built by hand through rugged terrain. But through that, they were able to get convoys finally into Jerusalem, bringing food, water, supplies, 100 tons every 24 hours, allowing them to survive. So the war ends on November 28, 1948. A lot of false armistices were given, and the armistice borders were set. And it shows you how those armistice borders were set. Israel now, at the end of this, possessed more land than what was originally partitioned to them. That's why you hear today all this talk about the pre-1948 borders. But yet, if you think about 1% of the population being gone, and not through a fault of their own, they were attacked by 3 separate armies. Yet, in all that, they were able to gain even more land. Yet, despite that, the sacred city of Jerusalem was divided at that point into 2 parts. One Jewish, one Arab. That was part of the armistice agreement that was signed later in April of 1949. That could have ended it, but unfortunately it didn't. 4 years later, we have violence beginning again. The 6-Day War. Here you see Abdullah, the first king of Jordan, standing next to his son, who ruled briefly after his assassination in 1951. Talal was deposed in 52 and succeeded by his son Hussein, who stayed in that spot for many, many years. What happened in July of 1951, King Abdullah of Jordan was assassinated. He was saying his prayers at the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem. Remember, that was at that point even accessible to both Jews and Arabs. And he was assassinated while he was there, and all of the East Jerusalem area erupted in violence. That started a 14-year period of fighting between the Arabs and the Jews and Arabs and Arabs. It really is what led to a lot of the difficulties that we're still living with today. The attacks on Israeli citizens grew quite harsh. So the Syrian defense minister at the time, Hafez al-Assad, asked the Egyptian president Nasser to sign a three-way treaty. He was quite worried that things were going to happen and they were going to be indefensible. So he wanted to sign a treaty, three-way treaty, with Egypt, Jordan, and Syria. Nasser said, okay, we'll do that. We'll, again, despite having the difficulties that they had before, 48 said, we'll do this. And then he kicked out the UN military contingent that was down in the Sinai Peninsula. And it was soon after that that Israeli intelligence learned about this new trilateral alliance getting ready to attack Israel again. So at that point, it took a preemptive airstrike, which is what Israel has always done to protect themselves, on Egyptian military bases on June 5th, 1967. And so we started the Six-Day War, June 5th to June 10th, 1967. Diplomacy failed. Jordan participated in this alliance. And once that happened, once Jordan and Syria initiated the fighting against Israel, others were to come as well. And Israel forces had to attack. Interestingly enough, just like Joshua took Jericho in 7 days, those forces of Jordan, Syria, and Egypt were turned back in 6 days. And when that fighting was over, you see here, Israel captured several parts: the Sinai Peninsula, the Gaza Strip, which was later, the Sinai Peninsula was later returned. The Gaza Strip is still in dispute. Judea and Samaria, that West Bank, the Jordan River, the Old City of Jerusalem, and the Golan Heights. So here they were, surrounded again by these three countries and able to fend them off again. One of the places you can find accurate information is in Winston Churchill. Winston and his son Randolph wrote a book called The Six-Day War. In it, page 191 has this statement: by a feat of arms unparalleled in modern times, the Israelis, surrounded by enemies, superior in quantity and quality of equipment and overwhelmingly superiority in numbers, had fought a war on three fronts and not only survived, but had won a resounding victory. That's the facts. I'd like at this point for Todd to put up a poll, which I want to take amongst you, regarding whether or not you feel that you're getting accurate information out of the media regarding the facts and figures around Israel. So Todd, if you could put that up, I'd like to get that poll, because everything we see, whenever we have reports on what happened in 1948, what happened in 1967, I see misconstrued information, no reputable facts being quoted from places like this. So I'm glad to see no one feels yes, because I would agree with you there. Yeah, we're not sure. It's right to be skeptical of the things we see, because in most cases, I think it's very difficult to get accurate information. On that day, June 7th, the entire Old City fell to Israeli hands. Now, some would say it was to the day 868 years after Crusaders first appeared there. This photo I show you is quite interesting. Israeli army paratroopers that launched in there, the three of them, stood next to the Western Wall and had their picture taken at the holiest site in Jerusalem, that old city. And 40 years later, May 16th, 2007, they posed, those same three posed in the same spot for a picture, but those paratroopers came in, landed beside the old wall, and a lot of interesting information came out about that. Story was told that when they reached that wall, they burst into tears and began to pray because once again they had access to the most sacred site they knew. Rabbi Shlomo Goren, who you see here, blew the shofar. They prayed a live broadcast from the wall because now that site of the temple was once again into Jewish hands. But as we said before, peace wasn't going to last for long. Next, we would have the Yom Kippur War. Here you see a picture of Ariel Sharon, who was very instrumental in that war in defeating those that were attacking them, coming in again during that Yom Kippur War. Let's review that war. We had things going well for a while, but we see that in October of '68, two Arab girls entered the Zion Cinema, and there they had a bomb. They were observed, and it was removed. But the following month, we had a dozen Israeli shopping at the Yehuda market that you see here today were killed in the first of what would be multiple car bombings. Bombs also exploded at Hebrew University, at an Israeli supermarket. Tension rose throughout those early 70s in Jerusalem as car bombings, grenade launches, letter bombs, a whole new round of violence, and finally the use of terrorism on civilians. During that period of time, we saw October 6th of 1973, the Great Day of Atonement. We saw all-out war break out when when Egypt and Syria once again attacked Israel. In the north, Israeli guards were watching as Syrian tanks tore past their position, coming down against Israel. To the south, we had 400 Israeli soldiers, because remember this was Yom Kippur, faced 80,000 Egyptian troops coming up from the Suez Canal. That was October 6, 1973, holiest day of the year. Supposed to be a day for peace and reconciliation. No one in Israel expected to have a war at that point. Israel ultimately won that war. They pushed Syria from the Golan Heights, but yet they discovered there the vulnerability of trying to again defend borders and multiple enemies. It just became extremely difficult. That's one of the reasons why you can understand why they were so open to finally having negotiations, because it would be very difficult for them to continue to sort of do that. And Egypt had some early victories in that, even though it was turned around and finally Israel defeated them. It did give credibility to some of those Arab neighbors, and the Western world now watched eagerly. Israeli leaders finally agreed to meet with Egyptian leaders at Camp David in 1978. Those Camp David Accords were part of Jimmy Carter, who would later become a tremendous enemy against Israel. And they signed a formal peace treaty with Egypt finally in 1979. This was the first attempt to help stave off these old neighbors. Well, while they were doing that, a new enemy arose within Israel's borders. Who was that enemy? Yes, you see here the PLO, Palestinian Liberation Organization. Yasser Arafat, his gun on his hip, he addressed what was then called the African Unity Summit in 1975, saying, "There can be no peace, nor will there ever be peace without a Palestine." He didn't refer to the PLO resolution at all, which called for Israel's expulsion from the United Nations. On July 4th, 1975, we had an abandoned refrigerator put in Zion Square explode, killed 14 people, wounded 70, and the PLO, under that Yasser Arafat, now claimed responsibility. So it was, as the late 70s and early 80s dawned, we had this new enemy brought forth, the PLO, in the forefront. Israel even though it was trying to negotiate peace now with its neighbors, would not thrive in peace. We began a whole new series once we thought the Arab nations were resolved to allow Israel to live in peace, called today the Intifadas. Let's look at what happened with those. Here you see a picture of Rabbi Meir Kahane, who was the founder of the Jewish Defense League, as you know, was one of the more active groups. He was arrested for supposedly plotting to destroy the Dome of the Rock, where Israel, or where the Arabs have their mosque, the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Alan Goodman, who was a volunteer from America in the Israeli army, opened fire at the Dome of the Rock and killed 2 of the Muslim guards. Same time, 18 Orthodox Jews were arrested, claiming to be planning a bomb attack at the Dome. And finally, then, in 1987, we have a full confrontation between Israelis and Palestinians breaking out in December of that year. So what began as just kind of this small group of Arabs, and what happened in these isolated incidents now escalates into an organized rebellion in that first, what was called Intifada, that lasted almost a year. PLO, Arafat, proclaimed an independent state of Palestine, with Jerusalem as its capital. Now, Israel didn't even do that, but yet here he did it. And on New Year's Eve, he proclaimed that we are the active volcano in the Middle East, which will only calm itself when one of the youths of the revolution and the Intifada hoist the flag of your state over Jerusalem and our homeland, Palestine. Could any words be more inflammatory? Violence subdued now when Yasser Arafat and Yitzhak Rabin signed the Oslo Accords in 1993. It lasted a long time. Remember, President Clinton, again, brought them together to sign an agreement to no longer fight. Arafat pledged to recognize the right of Israel to exist. Said, we'll do it in both peace and safety. Israel was under great pressure from the U.S., just as it is today, and they agreed to the PLO, despite that history of violence, to be the representative of what were then called the Palestinian people. And then just a year later, Israel signs a peace treaty with Jordan. That was significant because 50 years of constant conflict, ever since they had begun, since before they had begun the nation. They thought, finally, we can put this conflict to rest. We've signed the agreement with the to recognize the PLO, and now we have signed the agreement with Jordan. Well, it seemed that way, didn't it? But militant Palestinians said, we won't give up the goal. We won't recognize Israel. We won't recognize, we want an independent Palestine with no place for Israel. And so what happened? They introduced a new style of terrorism, the suicide bomber. The task, one by one, to wipe out Israel. February 25th, 1996, a Palestinian man got on a bus, number 18 bus in Jerusalem, and detonated a bomb that was strapped on his chest. It killed 9 Israeli soldiers, 17 Israeli civilians. Who claimed responsibility? A group called Hamas, which has the name Zio. It's the first time we see them in prevalent position. So then, suicide, which is really, in my mind, genocide. It kills as many people as they can. Bombings became such an integral part of terrorist activities that it not only took over in Israel, but throughout the world. You may remember even in London, we had the suicide bombers. That went on for some time. And then Ariel Sharon, in an innocent visit to the Temple Mount in September 2000, which he had every right to do according to the negotiations and according to the peace treaties, Yasser Arafat, PLO, says, he's instituting violence. He's there just to make trouble. And so they started what was called the Second Intifada. That Intifada was never really ended. Today's Palestinian government has managed to keep the levels of violence against Israel in check after a great deal of fighting from 2000 to 2007. That death toll of 5,500 Palestinians, 1,000 Israelis, 64 foreign citizens, it took its toll. It's never really officially ended. but yet today we see a great deal of talking back and forth without any real action. That takes us up to really where Israel is today. If you want to read an interesting perspective on this, you can look at a publication that comes out of the Middle East Institute. This, I believe, is a free publication called The Legacy of Camp David. It reports on what happened over that 30-year period. It is an interesting read from the government's perspective on what went on. From our perspective, or from my perspective at least, I believe that last 60 years, Israel, as I tried to communicate here, really did seek peace. It was never the initial aggressor unless they had to act in self-defense or preemptive to prevent others from wiping them out. But yet neighbors have never agreed to let them exist. It has only asking to determine its own destiny, to discover, it then discovers new enemies, it gets interference from everybody else in the world. Zechariah 12:3 is a true prophetic statement of what I think goes on in the world today. Zechariah 12:3 says, "In that day will I make Jerusalem a burdensome stone for all people. All that burden themselves with it shall be cut in pieces, though all the people of the earth be gathered together against it." Certainly we'd have to say this is true today. Jerusalem and Israel has become a burdensome stone, not at their own initiation, but because everyone wants to have some kind of dictation over what happens there. There's few nations in the world where everyone takes an interest in saying, we're going to decide your fate, not you. This cartoon I thought was a very interesting one when it says, here's Israel standing in the middle, but we gave you land for peace. And you got Hamas on one side and Hezbollah on the other saying, we want that peace. It really doesn't matter. They just want Israel taken out of the land that is fought to defend. And even Jerusalem today is attempting to be split up and negotiated away. There is an important statement that God said to Moses in Exodus 23:31-33. There God fixed the boundaries for Israel and said that he would deliver those inhabitants into the land in their hand, and they were not to make covenant with them or with their gods. They were not to live in their land because they had sinned against, because if they did, they would sin against them. So I don't think personally that they should be doing what they are, but then again, when you're in a situation that they are, it's very difficult not to. I'd like to take a second poll at this point, and that's to know, a poll, Todd, if you'll put that up. I'd like to know how many of you have encountered difficulties when you've been trying to witness about Israel and just getting people to support a viewpoint that you would have. To even say that, Israel has a right to be in their land, because I surely haven't found it. And I think most people that are trying to communicate at least about the promises of Israel do encounter a great deal of difficulty. It's good. The initial resistance we see is pretty great. Yeah. So it's a pretty good number that we see from everyone having that same challenge. I think that's the problem is when you look at the first poll we took about the media, realizing the media doesn't report much accurate information, it's no wonder that there's this biased viewpoint against Israel. So we got 100% of those responding saying, yeah, we've all encountered that difficulty. Thanks, Todd. You can take those down now if you would. So Israel really has a desire for peace. God doesn't intend for them to be abandoned in that land. He does intend for them to occupy all the land which he gave to Abraham and his heirs. Jeremiah 23:7, remember, prophesies a regathering of Israel in our day that would be more notable than when Moses led the children of Israel out of Egypt. Although I'm going to talk more about this in our second part in a few weeks, I want to just mention a couple of very compelling arguments to show that God is working behind the scenes to rebuild this nation. Jeremiah 23:7 says, "Therefore, behold, the days come, saith the Lord, that they shall no more say, The Lord liveth, which brought up the children of Israel out of the land of Egypt. But the Lord liveth, which brought up and which led the seed of the house of Israel out of the north country, and from all countries whither I had driven them, and they shall dwell in their own land." Our day has seen a bigger migration than what came out of Egypt. 2 million probably came out of Egypt, and we've seen, as we said, now we have from 600,000 to a little over 5 million Jews really happening since the days of the 1940s and onward. Jewish population has grown to 5.7 million today, as we talked about in that first news article. And since 2006, the first time since 135 AD, there are more Jews in Israel than in any other country in the world. And remember what Netanyahu said. Netanyahu, that proclamation on August 4th to that group of new immigrants, he said, "We're very close to a tipping point." He says, for the first time in 2,000 years, there are going to be more Jews in Israel than Jews outside of Israel. That's where we're going. And he's saying that that Jewish future is here in Israel. I'd like to take a final poll, if we can. Todd, if you could put that poll up. Do you believe we should support Israel's efforts to defend itself? There are some that say Israel as a nation today is not the nation God intends it to be. Yet here they were established. We've seen a lot of the prophecies. Is it right for us to defend, even though they're having to fight for themselves? Is it right for us to defend their right to do that? Well, we have a majority of people certainly saying that they do, and others not sure. I personally think if you look at the history of the scriptures, they've always had to fight to defend themselves. From the first day Moses asked to cross the land, they've had to fight. So even though this nation, we'll talk more about that next time, isn't a nation that probably will be there in the future, at least to the extent it is today, they do have to defend themselves. Okay, Todd, you can take down that poll if you would. There are 3 R's when we think about Israel. There's first of all, we have the return of the people. I've talked a lot about that here, the number of people that have gone. The second thing is the restoration of the land. They've not only grown from that small settlement Petah Tikva, but they've really done an amazing job at restoring the land to the splendor which it's never had since the early days of Israel. Lastly is the redemption of the hearts, and that's part of what's the future. We know still has to come to Israel in the future. But it has been a great preparatory work that's going on today. It's not a religious nation, as we say today, but there's a definite influence for God. The public lands are really adorned by Scripture. You find Shabbat observed generally. You find Scriptures openly discussed, no issues about whether we should be putting up Bible Scriptures or not. And you have a lot of immigrants coming in. I showed you all those immigrants coming from former Soviet Union where they had no knowledge of religion at all, now getting this exposure to God and the Scripture. This is a great preparatory work that's going on in Israel today. Why is the peace untenable today? There's a lot of opinions, and these are some of the opinions you see out in the news. Some of the impediments that you see, all these gaps between Israel and Palestinians. You see a lot of the two-state solution that was proposed in 1967. And yet in all this, the peace process with Syria about the Golan Heights, there's just been no one that's been willing to really say Israel has a right to exist. I'm going to wrap up with Psalm 122, 6-9, and we'll have about 5 minutes or so left. If you've got some particular questions on any of this, now's the time to start keying them in, because we'll want to take at least a few if we can. and hopefully have covered some of this material that does sort out the fact from fiction. But let's remind ourselves that we are looking at Israel as a sign of God's kingdom. And God does give us instructions in Psalm 122 to pray for the peace of Jerusalem. They shall prosper that love thee. Peace be within thy walls, and prosperity within thy palaces. For my brethren and companions' sake, I will now say, peace be within thee. Because of the house of the Lord our God, I will seek thy good. Despite all the trouble and the difficulties that exist in Israel today, we know eventually God will bring peace there. It will not come easily. They've had to fight. They're still fighting. We know that at least prophetically there will be one great final attack that comes against Israel where God will display his support for them. So in that process, we do pray for peace, knowing that eventually it is God's will.